Today's episode is unlike anything we've explored before. In part one of my conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Tasha Faruqui, we talked about the concept of grief and surrender and what it means to have a child and love a child through what many parents can only think of as unimaginable. We explored Dr. Faruqi's experience as both a mother and a pediatrician, walking alongside of her daughter who is critically ill. And today we're going to go somewhere deeper. We're talking about consciousness today and the mystical and what can happen when the veil between these two worlds starts to get thinner. Welcome to The Authentic Path. I'm your host, Dr. Vanessa Calderon, Harvard-trained physician and healer. I integrate science and ancestral wisdom to support you in creating the success you desire in all areas of your life. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Welcome, friends. Before we begin today, I want to tell you a quick story about a research study that was published in one of the most rigorous medical journals in the world. It was published in what's called The Lancet. And this is a study that was published somewhat recently in 2001 by a Dutch cardiologist named Dr. Pim van Lommel. So what he and his team found was they followed 344 patients who had been successfully resuscitated after cardiac arrest across multiple hospitals. And of those patients, close to 20% of them reported what's called a near-death experience, also known as an NDE. And 12% of them described what researchers call a core experience. And what that means is this experience of leaving your body and potentially encountering deceased loved ones or perceiving events in the room while you are essentially clinically dead. Your heart is not beating. So again, this study was published in The Lancet. So this isn't some fringe study. The Lancet is one of the most rigorous medical journals that exist. So to be published there, you have to have multiple peer reviewers that read this and agree on the data, agree on the science, and agree that it was a pretty rigorous study. What this doctor did, the question that he was asking was kind of a really important one because according to current medical understanding, it shouldn't actually be possible to experience consciousness during cardiac arrest because if your heart's not beating, then what is experiencing consciousness? So if your blood isn't circulating and your lungs aren't breathing for you, your heart's not working, what is it actually experiencing the consciousness? And yet what he found was that these patients were reporting enhanced levels of consciousness, things that they said felt more real to them than what it felt like when they were back in their bodies, when they were in what we call physically alive. They were experiencing emotions and memories from early childhood. They were having perceptions of their own lifeless bodies from above in a dimension without our conventional concept of what we call time and space. And he's not the only person that has published these types of studies. In fact, at the University of Virginia here in the United States, Dr. Bruce Grison has spent 50 years on this exact question. He has studied over 1,000 cases of NDEs, of near-death experiences. And let me just back up with him quickly because the reason why he got into this work, he's a psychiatrist, so he's a physician with an MD, and he had noticed one of his patients who had essentially had a near-death experience. They had overdosed. When she came back, she came and she told him, "You were talking to my neighbor that was down the hall and you had this tie on and the tie it was a red tie and it had a stain on it." And the guy was like, Dr. Grison was like, "Hold on a second, that's bizarre. There's no possible way you could have known that." And when he retraced his steps, the patient was exactly right. She had perceived when she was clinically dead, having this near-death experience, something that there was no way she would have known, something that was down the hall, not in the same room. No one had talked about it to her, something that was so obscure. And that for him was when he started getting really curious about what is actually happening. Because when you are a true skeptic, like I consider myself a true skeptic, what has to be true is that you also have to be open. You have to have an open mind. True skeptics have open minds. And that is, I think, what differentiates true skeptics from cynics. A true skeptic has an open mind. They're curious about what other people are experiencing. And if you're a scientist, like I also consider myself a scientist and a researcher, you dive deep into how could this be possible? And that is the curiosity that drives so much of the research and so much of the discovery that we have now, and so much of what we see in the world of expanded consciousness and near-death experiences. So I'm telling you all of this because today's conversation is going to take us somewhere where many podcasts don't go, where my podcast hasn't gone directly, but has sort of gone a little indirectly. And my guest today happens to also be a very, very dear friend of mine, Dr. Tasha Faruqui. And this is part 2 of Dr. Faruqi's story. So part 1 was published last week, so you can hear that episode if you haven't yet listened. So Dr. Faruqui is a mother, she's a pediatrician, and she's an author of the book called Keep Your Head Up. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful story, and I highly recommend it to any of you that are curious and interested about a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today. She's someone who has held the hand of her precious daughter, Soraya, as she has been navigating complex critical illness. And she has noticed things that it seem a lot of people would say, how is this even possible? And that is where we're sort of going today. So if you're someone who sort of needed a little bit of the science because maybe you're a skeptic like I am, I wanted you to know that the science exists, the science is published, and the truth is that I believe that Western medicine is still catching up to a lot of what our indigenous and our ancestors have known for generations and generations, that they have been practicing and connected to something so much bigger than us, this higher consciousness. And Western medicine, I think, is just catching up. But there is a lot of data published in very rigorous articles in The Lancet, coming out of UVA, Johns Hopkins, the University of Michigan, and really hospices around the world that are really showing us that we're living in a moment right now where the boundaries between what we can actually measure and what we have always known, what has been passed down to us from lineages, is getting very porous. So today we're going to let it be open, and we're going to talk about what becomes possible when we stop dismissing the mystical and just allow ourselves to be open to it. So Dr. Tasha Faruqui, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me and approaching this subject that I don't think enough people are talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And why don't we just start right there? Because, in part 1, we talked a little bit about the concept of surrender, really letting yourself just be open and letting sort of divine or greater consciousness, God, whatever you want to call sort of that, something bigger than you kind of take over. And so I'm curious for you, at what point did you begin to realize that something was happening that was beyond the ordinary with Soraya?
I think there were almost glimmers of things happening with Soraya that you could almost say that's a one-off and almost talk yourself out of something bigger happening. And these moments, some of them are highlighted in the book, but there is still so much more depth that we could go into with each kind of episode that I mentioned in the book. The first is when she was a baby, and it was honestly at one of my breaking points. She was crying. She had really bad reflux. I knew that she was in pain and I could not comfort her. And it's this moment of, this is my job as a mother and I can't do this. And I was sobbing, holding her, thinking to myself, God, people say that you can't handle more than what you give them, and I can't handle this. I don't know where that saying comes from, but I'm actually giving up. It's a very dark thought, but I had thought either I'm going to die trying to care for this child, or she is going to die because I'm not going to be able to. And I was having such this feeling of overwhelm, like, please just help me. And I had ended up tagging out my husband, Safi, and I told him, I said, I know that it's your turn. I texted him, I know that it's my turn to comfort her, but I need you to tag me out. I handed Soraya to him. And even though he couldn't get her comforted, he was more worried about me. So he laid her in her crib with the monitor and came downstairs to comfort me. And we're both sobbing, like, how can we care for this child that we can't even comfort? And then we looked over at the monitor and we see this white light, so bright, that is just stroking Soraya to a place of being comforted. And in that moment, we both knew. It wasn't even like, do you believe it? Do you not believe it? We just were like in awe. And we started recording it because I knew it was something that I would want to see and remember. And I watched that, and then almost right afterwards, we were both almost cross-checking each other's religious beliefs of what do we think just happened? How do we interpret it? And why does this feel so sacred? That was the one thing that we both agreed on, that this was something so sacred and so beautiful. And it was our sign that there's something bigger than us. There is something that is guiding us or caring for us, and that we're not alone in this. That was episode 1, we'll say. Fast forward when Soraya was verbal, which she didn't really say her first words until she was 3. And she was talking about a friend that she was going to take to preschool with her. And I thought it was an imaginary friend. But then she said, no, it's one of my angels. And I said, oh, well, does the angel just go to school with you? And she goes, no, they're with me all the time. And I said, well, when was the first time you remembered them? And she said, when you were carrying me. They're there with me from the time that I was supposed to be here. So that was another time. And then when things started kind of being more consistent was honestly, there were like, again, these little hints of before we would put her to bed, there were these moments where she would say almost messages. And I say messages because the language and the words that she used were not words that she would use. And so it would be things like, Mom, I want you to know that you're my savior. Because of you, I am here. And it's almost like words that I needed to hear in that moment. But they weren't words that Soraya had the language for. And so my husband and I would both have these moments where I'd be like, what did she say to you? And it was almost like our back and forth of like Soraya-isms that we would call them. But we also kind of intuitively knew that they weren't actually her, that they were from something beyond us. Whether it's spirituality or religion, it was still in line with what both of us do believe in. Then there was a time that we were sitting at our table and Soraya out of nowhere says, Mom, your uncle is so kind. Now I have a lot of uncles and culturally we call a lot of people uncles. And I was like, thank you, Soraya. Now, which uncle are you talking about? And she says, the uncle that has died. And I also unfortunately have a few uncles that have died. And I said, which one? And then she moves her hands like this. And she's like, the one that smoked all the time. And what's interesting about this is I have an uncle that was like a father to me. It was an uncle that we had lived with after my mom got divorced and really, really took care of us and took us in where we had nowhere to go. And he was a chain smoker. But he died when I was 12. And because of that, he oftentimes is not brought up very often, especially with Soraya, because there's just so much time that has passed since he was here. And I said, Soraya, like, how do you know him? And she's like, oh, he's talking to me. And she's like, he's so kind. He's so funny. And she said, I want you to know that he's partying all the time. And while that seems like such a random statement, it actually has a story attached to it that she has no idea. And that story comes from when I was a little girl, he used to put me to bed. And when he used to put me to bed, he said, now, Tasha, when everybody else is sleeping, while you're sleeping, I'm going to wake you up in your dreams. We're going to party all night. And so it was our joke that we would say every night. I was 4 at the time. And it's something that I've had seared in my memory, even though I was such a young age. And so that is where it dawned on me, where I said, Soraya, can you connect, with people? And she said, yes, with our family. And so it kind of started where she could tell me what my grandmother smelled like. And that description is something that is so hard unless you knew her, that in those moments, there was no doubt that Soraya, this child that has no filter in how she speaks. And now I'm thinking of the filter of what separates us from this time on earth and to whatever is beyond us. And the next people that she would really share were family members. And then it was my husband's best friend that died suddenly in his sleep. And she was able to share messages, again, in a language that she wouldn't use. Things like, bro, I'm really proud of the surgeon that you've become. And the thing that I'm most proud of is the type of father that you are. This is language that Soraya wouldn't say. And that also helped my husband, who is very logical, analytical. He's a surgeon, and I say that in a very stereotypical way because of how he looks at things. He's also a very devout Muslim in looking at things in the construct of religion. And that just took him aback, where there was no question of what Soraya was seeing, because again, she has no malintent, no reason to manipulate, no reason to say anything other than what's coming through. Once Soraya entered hospice, what we realized is as she started declining, which she does have this progressive neuromuscular disease, so there are stages that I see of things getting worse. And while I have no idea when this timeline is, I know intuitively that there is a decline, and it's something that none of us, even her physicians, can't decline or deny, I should say. But as that's happening, it's almost like she has more access to the other side. And while other people describe it as a veil, I see it as a veil, and I also see it as it's just thinning because the amount of input that she is getting is unbelievable, to the point where I ask her and she says it happens all the time. And she says, I don't even tell you about it anymore. She said, I don't want to spook people. And what's interesting for somebody who doesn't have a filter, it's almost like she still knows who she feels safe sharing with. And she also knows that it scares certain people. Although when I ask her about this skill or this talent, she actually doesn't like that. And she says that it's not a skill or a talent, and it's actually something that we all have the ability to do. And that also threw me off. She said kids especially can do it. And she also said, especially those that have special needs or complex medical disorders, she feels that that is like almost like an extra access. And she says that we all have the ability, but she also clarifies that people do it in different ways. And the way that she explained this to me is, she's at home now, so she doesn't go to school. So she does have free range on her iPad. And I sometimes find her watching shows about either ghost hunters or mediums. And I'll say, why are you watching this? And does it scare you? And she said, no, it doesn't scare me at all. And she said, I find it interesting because they're doing what I'm doing, but they're doing it in a different way. And I want to train myself to do it in their way too. And it's so interesting to her that how they do it. And with that, I say, do you see scary things? Do you see mean people? And she says, sometimes yes. And she says, I just have to tell them to leave. And I've asked her, I said, is it overstimulating? And she says it can be, but she doesn't want it to stop. So she wants it. And, I'm cautious and protective as any mother would be of like, what is this doing to her? Is this okay? But there is this level of trust that I don't have. I don't think I have the ability to block it. But what I've asked her, I said, well, I've heard, Soraya, that I can like burn sage or Palo Santo. And she said that one. And so I just go with it. I know that I've never even told her what that was. But there have been times where we've burned and I've let the window open and she'll tell me where to go. And she says that she feels very protected, that she's not scared of what she sees, and that she can either tune into somebody that is either wanting to come through, or if we're trying to connect with somebody. There has been times where I've asked her to connect and she says they're not ready or they don't want to. And I'm respectful for that. There was one major kind of breakthrough situation that occurred not that long ago. But before I get to that story, there's one other one where she mentioned a girl and she gave us her full name. And when we searched her, and Soraya told me that she was a teen and they were friends. And when I searched her, there was a story of a 15-year-old that had passed away and had donated her heart. And the recipient of her heart ran, so many flights of stairs. The article was about the parents of this girl hugging the woman that had ran up the flight of stairs. And so again, that was that acknowledgement of this is a real person. And we found her, and there's no other way for Soraya to have access to this name. So yes, this other moment that I don't know if I will ever have a moment like this again. And if I do, I will be forever grateful to be in its presence. Soraya was having a really hard time, and we were, again, these moments seem to happen in the privacy of the five of us or just Safi and I. But we were all at the table, and Soraya was, crying, and she was sharing how she felt like she was losing everything, her abilities, her ability to talk, her getting tired when she's eating, and her fear of losing us as a family, and how the relationship that she wants for her sisters is not where she would like it to be. And it was really upsetting, the sisters, and they tried to separate, and I said, "Nope, let's hear each other out." And we gathered to the family room, and everybody was just kind of listening to Soraya kind of cry. And in this time, it's almost like something came over her, where again, the language changed, where her voice was the same. But the things that were coming out were different than what she would say. She was crying and she was saying, "You guys all talk about this circle of life. It's not a circle of life. It's a tree of life." And she said, "I want you to know that I have a contract with my sisters, even though I'm not from this universe. And that contract is love. Our goal on this earth is love. I cannot leave this earth until I've achieved love with my sisters, and we're not there yet." And then she looked at Yasmin, her big sister, and she's like, "You're too hard on yourself, and you are resenting yourself for things that you cannot change. You need to let that go." And she went to each of us, sharing these like pieces of wisdom of what we needed to hear. She needed to keep telling me that I was a good mother, and she needed to tell my husband on the anger that he needed to let go. And then she also continued to say that while she was not from this universe, neither was what we actually call her spirit animals, our cat, Ohana. And she's like, "Ohana and I are actually from the same universe." And she said, "I want you to know that I work with the angels, and I work with the angels that work with God. And these angels are working with me, but I'm trying to get them to have me stay here longer, and that has not been decided. But what I do know is I work all through the night, and I work with the angels, and I hear everybody's prayers." She's like, "People pray for their pets to be cured, their family members to be cured, and I'm working so hard, and I'm so exhausted from trying to help so many people, but I really need to work on this family." And then she said, "If you don't believe me, if you don't believe that this is coming from somewhere bigger, I want you to look at the window." And at this time, it's like 5:30 in the evening. And we look at the window, and there's this bright light that's shining through the window. And sure enough, it's shining on Ohana, our cat, who is like, "Yeah, sister, speak your truth." Like literally, the cat is just sitting there. And we are sobbing. We're all sobbing. And at that moment, like nobody dare get out their phone. Nobody spoke a word. We just let this moment. We were so humbled by the presence of what was being said. And then, we like all hugged, and we all like acknowledged that this was something beautiful that we may never experience again. And Soraya said, "You guys think that I'm really wise, and you think that I can read people's emotions, but I want you to know that I don't. That really what happens is there's angels that have this white ball of light, and they put it inside of my mouth, and that's how I speak, and that's how I know what to say." And then even later that night, when she was like, back to being herself, I said, "Do you remember that? Like, she goes, "Oh yeah, I remember all of that." And she's like, "Yeah, like I work with the angels. Like, yeah, that all happened." And she's like, "Yes, and it's a tree of life, Mom. It's not a circle of life. And also, I work with Mother Nature. This actually all goes with Mother Nature. These aren't separate things." And again, at that point, we all agreed as a family, like, these may not be stories that we share from the rooftops, just because we know there can be a lot of feelings and a lot of judgment. But what I know is, when you have everything to lose, like your child, you have everything to believe in, because this gives me comfort. And I truly believe that this is what I need to truly surrender, is to just know that there's so much more out there that I can't explain. And isn't that life? Like, we can't have it all figured out. And isn't that rare diseases? isn't that science? Like, I wish I could save my child. But at the end of the day, she was never my child to begin with. And there is just something more that's bigger than all of us.
Wow, that is incredible. So much of what you said, I just want to go back and highlight a few things. One is you and Safi are both physicians with analytical, logical brains. And so to navigate the experiences you've been having with Soraya and filter them through the logic, the right, the right brain, the left brain, your sort of upbringing, cultural upbringing, your religious upbringing, that entire journey, you kind of talked about a little bit, but I imagine there has been so much of both you and Safi, your husband, sitting together and just kind of like, did this really happen? Yes, and kind of supporting each other in belief.
Yes. And then we also really were cautious in how we shared our interpretation with Yasmin and Lena. And I say that because I don't want to tell them what happened. I want them to experience that experience. And I had them explain to me, what did they think? Who was that speaking? How did they interpret it before we shared anything? And it was almost like both Safi and I wanted to hear the siblings' perspective before we even debriefed with each other, just so there was no influence. I think that these experiences are so, again, sacred is like really the only word that I can think of it, where I think they're meant for interpretation of the people that are in that room. And I think that the people in the room were the ones that are supposed to be in that room. And so I don't want to taint, I don't want to discolor, and I don't want to create a story or a narrative that didn't happen. I want them to feel that for how it is, and it may look different, and that's okay. And it may look different for Soraya than what it does for Safi, or what it does for me, and I think that's okay. So yes, with that, we're very much like, did it happen? And the one thing that we all agreed on is that definitely happened. Nobody had any doubts, even though our perspectives are so different and our anchoring of our beliefs are slightly different.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things that I think is so important that you name is allowing others to have their own experience and own interpretation of what they are witnessing, experiencing through Soraya. I think some of the listeners know this, but maybe not everyone. I haven't really named a lot of this, but I sort of toe the line between these worlds of, graduated from Harvard. I'm a physician. I'm incredibly like analytical, science brain, very skeptical. And I was raised by mystics and indigenous healers. And I have this background of ancestral healing, which I have now allowed myself to sort of marry those two kind of parts of me. And one of the things I've come to understand is kind of like what you're saying. I can have an incredibly mystical experience, or someone else can have that, or Soraya can have it, for example. And I cannot force and I'm not here to force anyone else to believe. And for all of you listening, I'm not telling you what to believe either. What I want to do is open you up, open your mind up, and share these experiences with you so that you are open to having these experiences for yourself. And I think that is probably what matters more, because the way we open ourselves up to higher consciousness, and one of the beautiful messages, like the wisdom Soraya shares, is I am here for love, like that is my purpose. That's powerful. That is incredibly powerful. And the more we can open up to all of these experiences, the more we start to notice that there is something bigger than us available here. And again, this is not new age, right? This is something that we've had for centuries and centuries and centuries, this connection to something bigger. In fact, it's only been very recent, over the last 2,000 years, that we started separating these two things, and we started focusing on, materialist science, where I have to see it to believe it, as opposed to I can feel it, I can experience it, I can sense it. Before, that's sort of the world that we were living in. One other thing you mentioned is Soraya is naming these things as sort of matter of fact. And hold on, before I even say that, you explained this story of when she was 3, talking about these angels going to school with her as sort of this matter of fact, and how she's not the only one. Other people can have these experiences too. And you and I, Tasha, have spoken about this, but I'm just going to name this for the audience, which is there is so much data now around these experiences, especially with people that have been labeled as having a disability, like autism, for example. And so there's an entire podcast series called The Telepathy Tapes, for those that are not that aren't aware, that dives deep into the science behind what is happening with nonverbal speakers or folks that are labeled autistic and how they can actually communicate. And the data is so compelling. So if you're interested, I would recommend just go listen to the telepathy tapes. Start from episode 1, season 1. There's now 2 total seasons and a third coming out called The Talk Tracks, where Soraya, and I think, are you on it too, Tasha? Where you and Soraya will both be on it?
Yes. And so is Safi, actually, as a skeptic. Yes.
Oh, the 3 of you?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's going to be so good. So I think that comes out in June, right? You said?
Yes. Yes. It's slated
Okay,
for
so
June.
that's incredible. And I think this is going to be published right before that comes out. So, or might, if it publishes after, we'll make sure to link. But I'd love for any of you that are curious or even skeptical, because those are my favorite people, because you're coming from my heart, just start from episode 1, because you'll start to understand the data, which is really, really incredible. Okay. So the other thing that I think is so beautiful with children when I hear these things is how matter of fact they name these things that I think as we grow up and we are colored by the programming of society, we start turning off our ability to access all of these other things because we start questioning, we start believing in doubt, there's fear, we're afraid to be perceived as, crazy or woo or all of those things. But the children will say these things as a matter of fact. So I'm curious, how did you start to move along with this? Like, how did you grow as you started experiencing her wisdom and her sharing all these things?
I will say that even though I am known to be more open than, let's say, my husband, Safi, as far as, psychics and the woo or crystals or astrology, I will say that there are some things that Soraya had said that I did not initially believe in. And so one of those is I did look at people with a spiritual connection as people that had extra gifts, as chosen ones. I never ever put together that everybody could have access. So some of the things that she was saying actually made me stop and think about. And I was like, so this idea of having everybody have access, or the idea that we're all doing it, but maybe differently when it comes to a ghost hunter or a tarot card reader or an astrologer. This was in my mind blowing, because I had already compartmentalized these as different skill sets that each person had. And I never thought of it as one. And that really challenged my thinking in so many ways, not only that everybody can have access, but also about religion. It all of a sudden made me think of religion, of what if it's all true? What if there's elements of religion and spirituality that are all true? Why does it have to be one or the other? Why are these different things? And so her matter-of-factness really made me think about things in a completely different way. And that's coming from somebody who I had already considered myself as being open. And when I first shared about telepathy tapes with Soraya and the concept, and I was telling her about how much I love this podcast and what they're sharing, she looked at me like it was no big deal. She's like, yeah, they have a podcast on that? That's literally her response. She was not impressed. And she's like, yeah, I know. She's like, we can all do that. Like, she was like, so again, the fact that she was so matter of fact, it really stretched my brain in a different way. I, again, thought that everything that she would tell me would be things that I knew, and I was wrong.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful when you have your mind open. And so much of what she's sharing, again, I just want to name as incredible wisdom. There are people that have been living in these worlds of thin veiled or more spiritual or more open, or what we call psi phenomena in neuroscience. And a lot of what she's saying can be confirmed by folks that have been living this for their whole lives, or at least for the last 50, 60, 70 years of their life. For example, one of the things you said, does she ever see things that are overwhelming or scary, And her saying, yes, I just tell them to leave. That is exactly what someone in this world would tell you to do. Set boundaries with the spiritual world. If there's something coming to you that you don't want to experience, tell them to turn it off. And so I just think that that's incredibly wise and so powerful. I think that's so beautiful. Obviously, we could talk about this forever and ever and ever. We could talk about this for hours because there's so much for us to chat about. But I want to just be really thoughtful about your entire experience. And for those that want more, I highly recommend you see her episode that's coming out on the talk tracks or the telepathy tapes this next season in June. But I'm curious, if Soraya wanted us to know something, if she wanted to teach us something, what do you think she'd share with us?
She actually constantly shares. And so her biggest thing is really treating people with kindness. And then also, she is always advocating for those that have complex needs or have any type of disabilities. And it's really to show them love. And again, that is really her mission, which she has made that clear. And she does that in everything that she says and does.
That is so beautiful. And I think that's the perfect way to end this episode. For all of those listening, if you're curious about what is this next step, what is this purpose, and you have heard for many decades how folks have focused a lot on love. One of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes is, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And to hear from such a wise soul, Soraya, who has, with this like precious energy, she doesn't have a ton of energy living in this body, but with the precious energy she has, focusing on how she can expand these gifts, how she can be more helpful in this world, how she can ask for more time. Who knows if she's going to have more time, she says, but if I have the ability to have more time, I want to help more people. That is just so inspiring. And I just think that that's such a beautiful way to end this, to remember, wow, if you can remember anything, is what if the purpose is love? What if the purpose is service? How beautiful. What a beautiful world we would be living in.
So true.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience and from bringing Soraya's story to us.
Thank you for having me and giving me a space to share.
Absolutely. Hey friends, if this episode resonated, please take a quick second and leave a review, share it with a friend, or post it to your community. It's how we keep helping others who are walking a similar path, and how together we grow the movement of consciousness in business, leadership, and life. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you next week.